Welcome everyone to the NCRCRD webinar, the first webinar of the year. And I think it's very nice, and we'll learn a lot. And if you're looking at the virtual thing behind me, this is the RRDC's 50th anniversary. So the Rural Development Act of 1972 was signed in August. That started the RRDC's and rural development, I believe. And so we are celebrating our 50th anniversary. So I'm sure we will try not to spam you too much about our 50th anniversary things, but I'm sure you'll hear things about us throughout the year, from us throughout the year, about the 50th anniversary and the things that we want to do to commemorate the 50 great years that the RRDCs have been doing great work, and looking forward to another 50, we hope, years going forward. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mark Skidmore, who is going to be doing the webinar for us today, The Impacts of Flooding on Business Activity and Employment, a Spatial Perspective on Small Business. So Professor Skidmore holds the position of Professor and Morris Chair in State and Local Government Finance at Michigan State University. He has a joint appointment in the Departments of Agriculture, Food and Resource Economics, and the Department of Economics, and is a distinguished scholar at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Professor Skidmore conducts research on public sector economics and economic development. And with that, Mark, I pass it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Maria. It's nice to be on the other side of this after hosting the NCRCRD webinars for a number of years. So glad to be here, and thanks for those who will join online or later on watch the video or the webinar via recording. So yeah, this work is co-authored with Quan Sun and John Mann. Quan Sun was a postdoc with the NCRCRD over 2 years ago now, where we started this work, and John Mann was an affiliate with the center as well at the time, and is a professor at Michigan State University. So I just want to acknowledge that the role of the NCRCRD as including the transition to Purdue University and providing financial support for this work. So I have the usual disclaimer here, and also the presentation is based on an article that's forthcoming in Water Economics and Policy. So the catalyst for this study was the Great Flood of 2019, which affected our region. It was primarily occurred along the Missouri River. It affected 31 million people, and 4 people died, caused over $6 billion in damages to property and agriculture, a lot of infrastructure damage, disrupted barge and other transportation traffic, and the extended duration of the flood reduced crop planting by millions of acres. So it was a very significant event, and right now we're still reeling from the pandemic, and our focus has been on that. But other types of disasters have huge impacts. And I started working on economics of natural disasters over 25 years ago. I was spending a year in Japan in a Fulbright, and I started looking at the Kobe earthquake, which had a huge impact on the Japanese economy in the Kobe region. It was a very manufacturing-oriented region, and it caused me to start thinking about sort of the long-run impacts of disasters, not just the immediate sort of impacts, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but sort of long run. What, if you live in a disaster-prone area, does that affect your time and risk preferences? Do you think about the world differently? Do you save more? Do you invest differently? Does that have impacts on economic growth in the long run? Those kinds of broader questions. And so it's been very rewarding to work in this arena for all of these years. In the case of this particular flood, of course, it can affect agriculture. It can also do significant damage to infrastructure, which can really slow things down and increase driving times, for example. It also affects business areas within towns and residential areas. So can have both short run as well as lasting impacts on a community. And so a lot of work has been done to evaluate different types of hazards. Flooding is perhaps the most common event in the United States, and probably in terms of economic damage, among the highest of all the different types of disaster events. And it occurs everywhere. And the types of floods are different for different areas. If it's a flash flood, then it's a major risk to life. But for a flood like the Missouri River flood here, it probably wasn't an immediate crisis. It just was coming, and we have warning systems that enable people to prepare for it. So we didn't have a lot of life in this case, but flash floods are a very different type of event with different impacts. So the impacts of disasters in general and flooding specifically are really diverse. And if you look at the literature, you see quite a few different conclusions regarding the impacts of disasters. First of all, you can have a short-term assessment, and there might be a temporary slowdown or a halt to economic activity until the immediate crisis is over and things, begin to recover and get back to normal. There's also an inflow of resources from insurance, savings, loans, government resources, et cetera, which can have a positive impact depending on how quickly those funds are accessed. The longer term impacts can depend on the degree of infrastructure damage, the degree of the restructuring of the economy. It may, in a developing country scenario, a disaster can have long-lasting impacts. The Haiti earthquake was devastating to the country as a whole and led to massive loss of life. They just didn't have the resources or the protections that a developed country would have. And so that can have, in a developing environment, these long-term impacts can be very lasting and devastating. In a developed economy, it might be a very different kind of environment where you have this inflow of resources from government, you have insurance markets, well-developed financial markets, and so you have this flow of resources coming in. And in the United States, I would say that much of the research shows that, in a subnational context, that there are these positive effects that can occur in the short run and to some degree in the long run. Sometimes the town that's affected, I remember it was a town in Kansas. I don't remember the name of the town, but it was affected greatly by a tornado. And it thought, well, we're gonna remake our whole economy and our whole downtown in a way that meets our needs. And so they really reinvested in a totally different way. So their whole economy was restructured, and hopefully in a way that would better meet the community needs. Same thing with the earthquake in New Zealand. There was a huge impact on a city on the southern island, and the city just decided to, basically its downtown was destroyed. But the city leaders said, you know what, the structure of that downtown environment didn't meet the modern needs. And so it decided that it was going to start from scratch. And they totally revamped, but it required cooperation of all the property owners, the cooperation of all the local government authorities, and the national government stepped in to provide support. And it took longer, but they totally rebuilt their downtown area in a way that was completely different than what it had been before. And I haven't tracked to follow up what exactly happened in terms of its population base, whether it's thriving or not. But that's an example of an entirely restructuring of the infrastructure and the economy as a whole in response to an earthquake. So those kinds of things can happen. I want to talk about this a little bit later on. There are some cases where there are small towns that had been in floodplain areas and they just got hit one too many times by flooding. And so the community as a whole just picked up and moved to higher ground and reestablished their town at a higher level. So sometimes that happens. I think that's sort of an area from an extension standpoint that I think might be really helpful for us all to think about, because there are many constraints and rules and zoning guidelines and all kinds of issues that need to be thought through before such a thing could happen. But in the long run, it might be best to actually move a town out of the flood zone. But there are significant upfront costs and significant constraints to doing that. From an economic analysis standpoint, the spatial aspects are also really important, because the impact of the flood can have a direct impact on the affected area, which may spill over jurisdictions, but also there's this sort of spillover effect where it can have either a negative or a positive effect on a neighboring jurisdiction that isn't directly affected. And so that suggests that spatial econometric tools would be important in analysis. And those effects can be both positive and negative. Sometimes those neighboring communities provide support and can be an economic gain for them. Other times it can have a negative spillover effect. And then, of course, you can look at different sectors, and they can have different impacts depending on the sector and the flow of funds coming in. Reconstruction, oftentimes after a disaster, the construction industry has a boom, for example, whereas maybe restaurant services or other types of services might be slow for a period of time until things kind of come back to normal. So the idea here is that there isn't any, clear theoretical, yes, disasters are going to always negatively affect an economy, or they're not always going to positively affect economy. There are many nuances in the evaluation, depending on the scope of analysis. Is it short-term, long-term? What's the spatial aspects, etc. So the factors affecting the duration and impacts of a disaster, of course, the magnitude is really important. How big of a disaster is it? The quality of the infrastructure, as well as economic structure and the degree of human capital, are all very important. Community and private business planning is important. The recovery effort, how effective that is, degree of available resources within the community from private savings, etc., as well as external flow of resources from federal government or from insurance and other types of resources. All those things play a role. And in general, these factors can be kind of lumped into two ideas, which are a little hard to define: degree of vulnerability and resilience. Some places are quite vulnerable depending on their infrastructure and the resource base. And other places might be less vulnerable, but not able to recover quickly. And so this idea of resilience is how quickly can you bounce back and recover. So all of these factors play a role, and in any evaluation, different types of disasters and magnitudes of disasters have different impacts. So we can kind of focus on some types, some magnitudes, and whether it's short-term, long-term, and potentially come up with potentially different impacts depending on all of these characteristics. Now, the paper that this presentation is based on has a fairly complete literature review. And I've already sort of highlighted this, but there are short run analyses, there are longer run analyses, there are cross-country analyses that are either using cross-sectional techniques or panel data techniques. There are subnational analyses as well, focusing on a particular region or looking at a whole bunch of regions within a country, such as the one here. We're going to be looking at the US counties in a panel framework. And then of course your time period analysis, the length of time, enables you to look at the short run, longer run. So there's scope, there's business, different sectors of the economy. We're going to look at several business sectors, and there are the spatial aspects. We can look specifically at businesses and households as well, using survey tools. And Maria has done some work along these lines as well, and has a number of papers on disaster impacts and effects. So I'm not going to talk specifically about the literature, the background, because it's quite extensive, and I think you can read about it if you'd like. Okay, so the contributions of this particular study, first of all, we're not focusing specifically on the 2019 flood, but we want to draw conclusions from this evaluation that could apply to that. So we're looking at the impacts on county level, regional economies using data from 1999 to 2012. We're going to look at, as measures of economic activity, local employment and the number of business establishments. We're going to look at it by sector. And we want to also try to capture any potential spillovers, whether positive or negative, using spatial econometric techniques. We also divide out major from minor floods. There are many floods over this period of time. So how we define major and minor, I want to talk about in a few minutes. And finally, our analysis is dynamic so that we're able to track what happens, not just in the period of the flood, but in the 2 or 3 years following it. So here we are using a theoretical framework from FEMA for floods. And this chart just sort of maps out the direct and induced and indirect economic losses that can occur from physical damages, direct economic and social losses, induced physical damages, and direct physical damages, and then in aggregate, the overall. So this model kind of maps out what you might expect in a county or a particular regional economy from a flooding event, but it doesn't consider the spillover effects. And so in our model, we kind of use this as the basic framework for helping us see what the mechanisms of impacts are, but also we want to look at the spillovers into the neighboring communities, et cetera. One thing I'll say about the spillover effects as well is we focus on sort of the spatial spillovers in that community, whether it's a neighboring county. But a lot of times with the way supply chains work, the spillovers don't necessarily have to be the contiguous county. And so the supply chain patterns, there's a whole nother line of research kind of looking at that. And we're kind of facing that with the pandemic right now, because we've had these different layers of closing of economies globally, which have impacted the supply chains. And that's exacerbating our access to goods and services right now to some degree, but also affecting prices as well. Okay, so the data, our dependent variables are, again, employment and number of business establishments for all sectors of a county economy. We focus on agricultural services as well as services. We look at manufacturing, construction as well. And we look at the number of establishments by size. We're especially interested in smaller establishments as they seem to be more vulnerable. Our flooding data come from NOAA. And we explored different ways of slicing major floods to minor floods over this period. We picked a value for this evaluation at 5 million. Anything that caused more damage than $5 million was considered a major flood. Now, for a smaller rural county, that might be a significant amount. But if it's like a highly populated urban county, $5 million wouldn't be anything. And so, this was the cutoff we used for evaluation here. we could increase the size of this amount, and we get fewer floods in the major category. Or we could define it as the damages from the flood as a proportion of the economy. We explored all of those things. So the results that I'm going to present here are sort of representative, give you a flavor of the impacts. But you have to keep in mind here that, you know, for a rural economy, this might be a significant flood. But if it's an urban area, a more urban, highly populated area, a major flood as it's defined here wouldn't be that, you know, very big at all. So it was kind of a pragmatic choice. We also want to control for other factors that would affect employment and the number of establishments. So we include measures of tax burden. Tax burden can potentially be endogenous, so we address that issue. We look at income, working age population, elderly population, and non-white population as controls. Okay, so the econometric specification, it is panel data. So we want to include fixed county and time effects. And we use the spatial Durbin model, which has global spillover effects. And we found evidence of these spatial relationships, both in the dependent variable as well as the independent variable. So we have spatial weighting matrices that address both of those issues in this regression, and are the regressions that we present. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump to the regressions, and I'll go through it kind of quickly to kind of give you a flavor of it. This is the result for all sectors, and you can see in this first column here, employment, the employment effect on number of employees, the number of establishments overall, and then the number of smaller establishments as measured by 1 to 9 employees or 10 to 49 employees. And so the main variables you want to look at are these major floods and minor floods. And you can see, using the criteria of a major flood and minor flood, we don't see huge impacts, very small. The minor floods are associated with maybe a small increase in overall total effects. This is the direct effect as well as the spillover effects on number of employees and number of establishments. So, you know, the way to think about this perhaps is that there's this inflow of resources to recover, and that might spur the economy a little, but it's not long lasting, and you don't see much happening over the lag periods for both major or minor floods. So the first takeaway of this evaluation is that the floods as we've measured them don't have really big impacts on the overall economy. And if there are, it's a little bit positive, and it doesn't last very long. And I think that makes sense given the way we've defined the magnitude of the floods. If we turn to agricultural services, which is perhaps this is our biggest effect that we observed by sectors. You can see here more significant effects for major floods. The coefficient on major floods is negative, and significant for employment and number of establishments, and much bigger for major floods and minor floods, which is reassuring. We would expect that major floods would have a bigger impact. And so this effect appears to affect agricultural services in a significant way. There are some lasting effects. You can see that major floods, you have this negative effect initially, but then a positive effect. And so again, one possible interpretation is that this is leading to a negative effect initially, and then as resources flow in and the economy ramps up, a positive effect in the subsequent period. So this was the direct effect in the county that was affected. The indirect effects are, well, you can see, oh, I'm sorry. Let me come back up here. So here I focus primarily on agricultural services on the effects on the county. I don't show the indirect and total effects because they're minimal. I didn't want to take time to look at those. But so that's agricultural services in the county that was affected. If you look at overall services, you see positive effects of both major and minor floods. And again, the major floods are much larger than the minor flood impact. So this is quite different, right? You have agricultural services with a very significant negative effect, but services as a whole have a positive effect for direct. And then indirects, this is sort of the spillover effect, is also positive for major floods. So you're seeing the neighboring counties kicking in and providing services to some degree.
Mark, if I can interrupt you real quick. So how would we interpret the coefficients, for example, for employment? Is that like the percent that would be decreased, or?
Yeah, as I recall, these are in log form, so these would be percent. Pretty significant. Thanks. Okay, so the overall effect for services for major floods, this is taking into account the direct and the indirects, and the overall effects are positive and significant, pretty large for the major floods, and negative for the minor floods. And you know, we've thought a lot about, like, well, why would this be? And one possible explanation is that for the major floods, you might see the inflow of insurance, federal aid, etc. But for the minor floods, it may not hit that threshold. So you see maybe small temporary negative effects for minor floods, but significant positive effects for major floods. So those are our main results. We also looked at manufacturing and construction, and we saw some minor effects, but not significant. But as an overall summary, the minor floods appear to have a small positive effect on overall business activity. The major floods appear to have a negative effect on agricultural services, but potentially a large positive effect on services overall. Very small or no effects in other sectors such as construction and manufacturing. It's a little bit surprising. I would expect construction to have been significant, but it wasn't in this study. We do identify spatial spillovers. Neighboring counties have a positive service effect. So it looks like when counties affected, the neighboring communities or counties kind of backfill, at least for a period. So our overall summary is that regional economies are pretty resilient, actually. The impacts tend to be short-lived. The nearby counties appear to provide needed services in the wake of the events. The only area that we examined that had a big negative impact was in agricultural service establishments, especially the smaller firms. And so we want to think about that, potential ways to help the most vulnerable firms, the smaller firms in general, but especially in this study, it looks like agricultural services were the most affected. In future work, I think it'll be important to sort of examine the larger events, the more significant, big impacting events. We've created a $5 million, criteria for large and small. we did that. We examined some different ways of slicing this, but I think we need to look at those large events more carefully. We do have pretty effective warning systems, especially for the kinds of floods like the 2019 flood. We kind of know that's happening. The flash floods are more of a risk to life, and that's a different type of analysis that would be required. One of the limitations of the county business pattern data, it does not include actual farms. So I'd really like to expand this. This was for a special issue, but if I had a little more time, I would have liked to have added farm establishments as well to look at those. And then finally, as I mentioned before at the beginning, I think it might be worthwhile to look at the economics and the public policy of moving towns out of flood zones. I grew up in a small town in Washington State, and very regularly we would have flooding in the valley, but the town was up high enough that it was never affected. Very few people actually there was a lot of farming that happened in the valley, but very few actual houses. We kind of all lived up off of the hill. But some places weren't so fortunate that way, and are actually in flood zones, and so they experience repeated floods. And there are some towns that have said, you know, we're just going to do this. We're going to move to higher ground. And I think it might be a very useful extension-oriented program to look at sort of the economics of that, as well as the zoning implications and property rights and all the factors that would have to go into making a decision about whether it's worthwhile to do that. All right, so I think I'll stop there and open it up to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mark. That is super interesting. We're a small enough group that if you want to just unmute yourself, that is perfectly fine to ask a question. But if you're shy and you want to put it in the chat, you can do that as well.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really interesting presentation. I just wanted to introduce myself. I don't have a question or anything, but I'm Remington. I'm a new health and farm stress educator for MSU. And I know you have met with Eric Karbowski before.
Oh,
and
yes.
So, yep. And so he recommended that I come here and introduce myself. I think this is really interesting in terms of farm stress and, you know, approaching farmers who have went through a tragedy like this. So thank you for all your work. And yeah, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Remington. I hope to see you on campus here. And there is this is your field as well, but anytime these kinds of significant events happen, for some people it's life-changing, and it's very stressful. So sort of walking through and with people through the crisis is an important component of disaster management.
Yeah, absolutely. And when tragedies like this occur, there can sometimes be this ambiguous loss too. You know, there's no clear answer to why this happened. And so there's this other unique component to this loss. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So Mark, what would be some of those smaller agricultural service type businesses? Are this like seed sales and things like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it generally like that, but I haven't looked specifically at what kind of, specifically which firms are in that category. So I'd have to dig in a little bit more.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So I was a little bit late to the presentation, so I kind of missed the first part. I was just wondering, so these are only kind of indirect damages, right? Like it's not what gets destroyed directly when the flooding event occurs. Is that correct?
Yeah. So So one measure is the infrastructure damage and the damages to property. So that's one impact. This impact is on the sort of a measure of the effects on business activity or economic activity as measured. You can measure economic activity in a number of ways. Some people will focus on county gross domestic product or some measure of overall economic activity. This one focuses on employment and the number of establishments. So it doesn't give you an economic measure of the physical damage. It gives you a sense of the impacts on economic activity as measured by employment and the number of establishments. So if the number of establishments go down, you know, that means that businesses are failing. They just go out of business. You know, it's a, you know, actually during the pandemic, we've had a lot of small businesses fail. So that would be that, you know, if we use this, that would be captured here, or the number of employees, and businesses stop engaging in activity, then they're not going to hire workers. So what's the impact there? So that would be a negative effect. But as we discussed, in some cases, there are positive effects that can be observed as well.
Another question, if no one else has one. So is there a way that we can see kind of like adaptation, like maybe some county that experiences a lot of flooding events kind of like gets better at, you know, handling the event and maybe more resilient and stuff like that? Is that a thing that you can see in this study?
Yeah, actually, that's a really good question. We don't capture the adaptation effect here. I have another paper with one of my former students, Jungmin Lim, on tornado impacts. In here, in that paper, we could include previous events that may have happened in the past. And if you've had an event in the past, a significant tornado event, you're far less likely to have fatalities from the next event. So here's an example of, you know, where there's this tornado event that's in recent memory in a community, and that heightens their expectations and preparations so that when the next one comes, people are prepared. And so there is this sort of adaptation that we capture. And there are a number of studies that try to capture this adaptation effect as well, but that's just one example. And also, yeah.
Is this already published? This presentation, this paper, this analysis?
It's forthcoming. Should come out here in the next few weeks.
Sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, it's coming out in Water Economics and Policy in a few weeks. It's forthcoming. You know, and again, as I mentioned before, one of the potential adaptations that some communities, not very many, but some communities have done, is to actually move out of the floodplain into higher ground so that they're not affected so significantly when the floods occur. But that's a costly investment, right? So you're weighing the present cost against the potential future losses from floods in the future.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And this is something that various communities are dealing with, right? So there's several communities that are being affected by the rising sea levels, right? Miami and some islands on the East Coast that may eventually not be little islands anymore, but be completely devastated. And they have to think about how do they move out? Do they stay? How long will that take? So it is a continuous thought process for communities, I think.
Yeah, and even with I was just thinking about this with the explosion, the volcanic explosion in Tonga. There was a tsunami warning, and years ago when we had the Asian earthquake and tsunami, there was a small island in the Indian Ocean that had, I think with the help of the Japanese, built these big walls around their island so that it was one of the few places that was fully protected from the tsunami that came across the Indian Ocean at that time. So that's an example of a preparation as well. It paid off for them.
Wow, that's great.
I don't think a seawall will protect an island from rising sea levels, though.
No. Well, do we have any other questions? Well, if not, or you think of them as I'm talking, let me know. Stop me. But Mark, this was super interesting. I look forward to reading the paper in Water Economics and Policy. Really interesting work. And this has huge implications for the Midwest because there are various states that do have quite a bit of flooding, flash
sure.
and slow moving flooding. So definitely something to keep in mind.
Yeah,
I have one question, but for you, I see that we are recording the session. Is there a way that I can access to the recording later on?
Yes, you register, so you will get an email that says when the recording gets edited, we'll be sending out an email to all the registered participants, so you'll have it. And you can always go to our website, and it's all the recorded videos are there. So yes, please feel free to watch it.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Sure. And before we go, let me say, before I forget, and say bye, that our next webinar is February 22nd from 2 to 3, and that will be retaining rural businesses through conversations to employee cooperatives. Mark, again, thank you so much for such an interesting webinar, and thank you everybody for attending.